Welcome, everybody. I'm Gina Neff, and I'm the director of the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge. It is my honor and privilege to welcome you to this event, Chaos Comes Calling with Sasha Abramsky. Today we'll be discussing this book. It is bold, interesting, important, timely, and it's from Hachette and Bold Type Books. It's harrowing, really. It's a timely tale of how polarization threatened to break apart two American communities, how one found a way back and the other splintered. We'll put in a link to order a copy of the book in the chat a little later on in this event. So we're delighted today to be joined by the book's author, Sasha Abramsky. Before I introduce Sasha properly, here's some points of housekeeping. This event is being recorded. If you're in the audience on Zoom, you won't show up in the recording, but any questions you ask will, of course, feature. The recording will be available on the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy website after the event. This event is being captioned automatically by Zoom, and if you have captioning, you can select it using the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen if you're on a web browser. And a corrected transcript will also be made available online after the event. Please follow us, tag us on social media. We're on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. Just search for the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy to find us. After the event, we would very much appreciate if you could complete a very, very short feedback questionnaire, and the link to that survey will be sent via Eventbrite, which you use to sign up for this event. We're going to start the event with a reading from Sasha for about 20 minutes, followed by conversation. And we want to make sure we use the last 20 minutes at least to answer your questions. Questions can be asked through the Q&A function on Zoom, and those questions, that button is just, again, at the bottom of your screen if you're on a web browser. Get those questions in throughout the event, and we'll pick them in the final segment. Now, it's my deep honor to introduce Sasha. Sasha Abramsky is a longtime political journalist and author who has spent the last 30 years, ask me how I know, exploring the American political and social justice landscape. Currently, the Western correspondent for The Nation magazine and a lecturer in writing at the University of California at Davis, Sasha has written extensively over the past 30 years on poverty, criminal justice, immigration, and the rise of the hard right and alt-right political movements. If after this event you want more, and I think this event will leave you wanting more, Sasha's on the latest episode of The Guardian's Politics Weekly America podcast with Jonathan Friedland. There'll be a link to that during this event as well. Now, Chaos Comes Calling is Sasha's 10th book, and we are very pleased to have him here with us today. Sasha, I'm now going to hand it over to you. Tell us a little bit about the book and what you're going to read today.
All right. Well, Gina, first of all, I want to thank you and thank the Minderoo Center immensely for putting this on. I'm terribly, terribly honored that you decided this was worth it. Couple disclaimers. First of all, those of you who know me in the audience know that I normally have thousands of books behind me. Instead, you're seeing empty bookshelves. I moved last week, so most of my books are still in boxes. So I put up just enough to prove that I do have a few books. The second disclaimer, which is a bit more important, I found out a couple of days ago that the book is being delayed for distribution in Britain by a month or so, not because of the book, but because there's some distribution problems. That said, you can order it from Amazon.com today. You can order it from Hachette.com today. So this is still a launch event for my book in the UK. Let me talk a little bit about the genesis of the book, and then I'm going to read you just 2 pages. I think reading any more than that for a Zoom presentation gets a little bit tiring to you in the audience. I've been writing and thinking about social justice themes for 30 years in American politics. I've been writing since I was 21 and moved to New York from the UK. And in that time, I've covered a whole bunch of issues like economic injustice, the criminal justice system, homelessness, economic inequality, hunger, the sort of doom and gloom things on the underside of the American dream. And I've always been fascinated and drawn, for whatever reason, psychological or otherwise, but I've always been drawn to the underbelly, the stories that often get ignored, that are often too painful to talk about. And one of the stories, one of the threads in the American story that has fascinated me and sort of horrified me has been the rise of these very right-wing political movements, not just in the last 3, 4, 5, 10 years, but really in the last generation or so, since the militia movement started during the Bill Clinton presidency in the 1990s. And I've interviewed probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people over the years about these issues. And I've been thinking for a long, long time about why so many Americans seem to be so predisposed to fall for very extremist political rhetoric. Now, about 9 years ago, my editors at The Nation magazine came up with this idea that I should cover Donald Trump, the rise of Donald Trump. It was either the best thing that anyone ever did for me journalistically or the worst thing. It was absolutely fascinating and also absolutely horrifying to cover. Those of you who know me know that 9 years ago, my hair was both fuller and darker than it is today. Now, that could be causation, it could be correlation, I'm not really sure. But, you know, the last 9 years of reporting have been difficult. The first story that really made me aware of just how serious Donald Trump and the Donald Trump movement was in February 2016. And about a month earlier, Donald Trump had released a very demagogic television advert saying that if Donald Trump was elected president, he would immediately shut down all Muslim migration and visitation into the United States. It was probably the most demagogic television advert in American presidential history. So in February 2016, a month after that, it was the Republican Party primaries and caucuses. They were beginning. And in Nevada, which is just over the state line from where I live, in Nevada, they were having a caucus. And the way the caucus works is instead of just casting a vote, you actually go into a group setting and you communicate and you talk and you debate with other people about why you're supporting your candidate and not the other one. So I went to a Baptist church in a place called Sparks in northern Nevada. And I thought, well, you know, I can talk to the Republicans who are caucusing for Donald Trump about what they think about the economy. But I'm going to get a whole bunch of boilerplate answers, because what they think about the economy, probably, given it's a Democrat in charge of the White House at the time, they're going to say the economy's bad. They're going to say the country's heading in the wrong direction. So let me ask a more interesting question. Given that Donald Trump has sort of just gone off on this tear about banning Muslims into the country, why don't I go and ask people who are caucusing for Donald Trump, what do you think about Muslims? And what do you think about Donald Trump's plan to ban Muslim migration? And the first person I interviewed was a middle-aged man. And I said, well, you know, you've heard of this advert, you've heard of Donald Trump's proposal. What do you think of it? And he looked at me and he said, well, I would give Muslims in America a choice. I said, oh yeah, what's the choice? Exile or the trench. And he mimicked a bullet to the head. And I did a double take. I mean, I was expecting a lot of horrible things, but I wasn't expecting that. I did a double take and I thought, well, you know, I'm going to look around. Surely all of his fellow Trump caucus goers who are sitting near him are going to be expressing their displeasure at this public display of bigotry. And I looked around, and instead of seeing people shaking their heads, I saw people doing 2 thumbs up. And then I asked a few more people, and I got very, very similar responses. There was this sort of immediate leap towards an extreme language of violence. And it shook me to my core. And I went outside to the parking lot. I phoned a dear friend of mine in Washington, D.C., who I've known for as long as I've known Gina, and from the same place, The Nation magazine. And I said to him, I think we're in a whole heap of trouble, because something is being unleashed here that is just different. It's dangerous, it's different, it's demagogic, and it's going to capture an awful lot of people in its wake. And over the last decade nearly, all of that's come true. That what started as this sort of bombastic, flamboyant, demagogic political candidacy in 2016 has morphed into this total cultural transformation on the ground level, where many, many communities, not all, but many communities, have been completely swept up in the MAGA movement. And so I started reporting more on what this meant on the ground, because it seems to me you can, you know, talk about it nationally, and you can talk about this at sort of a very senior level, you can say, well, you know, how's it happening in DC? What's happening in the White House? What's happening with political strategists at sort of elite think tanks? But actually, what really, really matters here is what's happening at a local level, on the ground, in towns, in communities, especially the kinds of towns and communities that are often ignored and forgotten about by the media, small towns in rural areas. And I found these two places that seemed to me to represent a perfect storm. And they did so for a couple of reasons. One was called Sequim in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, which had been captured by a QAnon supporting mayor, and especially during the pandemic, had just gone off on this jag of unpleasantness. The public health officer was basically subjected to death threats on a daily basis. There were lynch mobs outside the public health offices. There were young men in pickup trucks with guns patrolling the neighborhoods looking for the good doctor to intimidate. And they were being sort of, if not backed up explicitly, at least given a nod and a wink by much of the political leadership of the town. And the second place to focus on was a place called Shasta County in the far north of California. Now, you know, I'm sure that when you think of California, you think of a sort of very liberal coastal community. You think of the big cities like LA and Sacramento and San Diego and San Francisco. You think of a place where, by and large, the politics aligns with the liberal vision of governance, which is true if you just take the aggregate. But if you actually look at the smaller counties in California, especially in the north, many of them are extraordinarily conservative, and they bear much more in common with a place like Idaho than with a place like Los Angeles. And in Shasta County in 2020, it was being controlled by fairly conservative Republicans. Then the pandemic hits, and the pandemic changes everything because it sort of unleashes this wave of fear and uncertainty, and also unleashes this wave of lockdowns in response to public health, schools closing down, non-essential businesses shuttering, mask mandates being put in place. And it creates political chaos, especially in smaller communities, where from April of 2020, they're getting signals from the White House, from Trump's White House, that the lockdowns are illegitimate, that public health measures are an overboard response, even that COVID is a hoax. Later on, that the vaccines are these dangerous things that should be ignored or discarded. And that plays out in a place like Shasta very, very profoundly. And what happens is the conservatives who run the Board of Supervisors get replaced by even more conservative people who want to ignore or literally push back against all public health measures. And you have the rise of a series of very charismatic local orators who go to community board meetings and do online presentations and go on demonstrations and raise a ruckus. And they raise it in a really visceral way. And the language gets more and more intimidatory. And like with Sequim, so in Shasta, the public health officer starts facing daily death threats, daily intimidation, daily sort of efforts to stop her doing her job. Unlike in Sequim, where there's eventually pushback by liberals who organize and say, you know what, this just isn't going to hold. In Shasta, that jag rightward just continues, and you get more and more and more extreme right policies being proposed, not just around the pandemic, but around gun ownership, around election denialism, and how the vote count and the vote process goes on. All these issues that have become these sort of lightning rod issues in American politics, you see a microcosm in Shasta County. And to me, this was fascinating. And I'd been looking for years and years for a way to tell the story of America in, first of all, the social media era, because social media changes everything. It changes the way news is distributed, changes the way we understand fact and falsehood. It changes everything. So first of all, how do I tell the story of America in the social media era? Second of all, how do I tell the story of America in the Trump era, in this sort of hyper-demagogic, big lie era where you have a would-be strongman with a cult of the personality who is reshaping American politics and reshaping American democratic institutions on an hourly basis? And the third thing was, how do I tell the story of America in the pandemic era? Because it seems to me each of those three issues in and of themselves are a black swan event. Each of them sort of represent massive dislocation. But when you layer all three of them, one atop the other, that's when you get absolute chaos, which is where the title of the book, Chaos Comes Calling, originates in. It's where you get a complete breakdown of political and social and civil norms. And I, as I said, been looking for 10 years nearly for a way to tell the story of America in the Trump era. And with these two communities, I think I found it. if you want to understand why 47% or 48% of Americans are still supporting Donald Trump, despite 2 impeachments, despite him being convicted on 34 felony counts, despite him facing scores more additional felony counts, despite him being found liable for sexual abuse by a civil court, despite him being fined millions of dollars for defamation and hundreds of millions of dollars for his business committing tax fraud, despite him launching some of the most demagogic and misogynistic and racist language in modern American political history. If you want to understand why, despite all of that, Donald Trump remains competitive to return to the White House in 6 weeks in November, read the story of Sequim and read the story of Shasta, and it will give you an understanding of why democracy is shaking so fundamentally at the moment in this country. What I wanted to do is read very briefly a passage set in Sequim, and it's set in 2021. And the person I'm going to read you about is Dr. Alison Berry, and she was at the time in her mid-30s. She was the public health officer for the county of Clallam. And she had a pretty storied track record. She'd gotten her medical degree from Johns Hopkins University. She had then worked in a large public health and trauma hospital in Seattle and Washington. She had treated every hard-to-treat group you could possibly imagine: undocumented immigrants who lack insurance, homeless people, drug addicts, mentally ill, sex workers, you name it. If it was a difficult to treat, difficult to engage with population group, Dr. Berry, over the course of her career, had taken a stand and gotten involved. She was on the side of the angels, and she was tough as nails. She was a very short lady. She was quite diminutive, but she was tough as nails when it came to sort of doing what she thought to be right approach. And in 2020, in the first months of the pandemic, she'd been very proactive with her public health recommendations, with her social distancing and masking recommendations and so on. And she had aroused the ire of the anti-mask lobby, the anti-vaccination lobby, the anti-lockdown lobby, who had taken it very personally and had decided that they had a right to hurl every kind of invective her way that they could. Well, she didn't back down. And in 2021, if you remember those months in early 2021 when the vaccine rolled out, and this was before the variants that could dodge the vaccine, it looked for a while like if you got the vaccine, it would protect you. And maybe more importantly, it would protect your community. It would protect your neighbors. It would protect your co-workers. It would protect elderly, vulnerable people, immunocompromised people, and so on. And there was that sense of liberation, which is why so many people queued overnight those first weeks that the vaccine clinics opened, so that they could get that vaccine and renew their life. And states were desperate to reopen. States in America, countries all over the world were desperate to find a way to safely reopen their economies. And Washington State was no exception. And by May of 2021, a few months into the rollout, the governor decided it was time to start reopening the economy. But the problem was, because the vaccine had become so politicized, a huge number of people, mainly but not exclusively conservatives, mainly but not exclusively followers of Donald Trump, a huge number of people had decided to not get the vaccination, which meant it was still there, it was still circulating, and it was still a huge public health risk. And the trouble was, it was circulating most explicitly in indoor eating and dining settings, in bars, cafes, and restaurants. And public health officers realized that their hospitals were getting overwhelmed, that they'd reopened the economy. People were going out to bars, they were going out to cafes, they were going out to restaurants, they were doing what you do, eating, drinking, talking, and thus breathing on each other. And these were becoming epicenters for the disease. And it was overwhelming the hospitals, and the death rate in May of 2021 was going up. Alison Berry had an idea, and the idea she had was, well, what if we impose a vaccine mandate? You can go into these indoor dining settings, but you have to show a proof of vaccine at the door. And she asked the county lawyers if that was legal, and they said yes. So she put in place a temporary vaccine mandate. Now, it worked. From a public health perspective, within days, the infection rate plummeted, and within 2 weeks after that, the death rate plummeted. It was an unqualified success. It was so successful that soon the whole state of Washington implemented the same mandate. Problem was, she became an absolute lightning rod for the anti-vax movement. And the next day, the day after she introduced the vaccine requirement, she was getting hate mail and worse, not just from Clallam County and not just from the state of Washington, but from all over America. And then she was getting death threats from all over the world, from places as far afield as Azerbaijan and Latin America. She had suddenly become a sort of international poster child for the anti-vaccination movement to glom to. And the stuff that she received in her email box on social media, it was both bizarre and strange, and sometimes just plain wacko, but it was also intensely terrifying. So what I thought I'd do to give you a sense of what was going on in these local communities is read you 2 pages about what happened to Alison Berry in 2021. And I'm going to apologize up front. I don't like trigger warnings and I don't usually give them, but the language here is pretty disturbing. And the caveat is obviously it's not my language. I'm just quoting people who think they have a right to spout this bile on the internet. So without further ado, 2 pages from Chaos Comes Calling's prologue. Recently separated from her husband and raising her toddler daughter as a single mom, Berry suddenly found herself front center stage in a bitter conflict that risked tearing the country apart. Armed mobs began showing up outside her public health offices, threatening to lynch the doctor and her colleagues. When the phones rang in her office, her colleagues girded themselves, knowing that there was a pretty good chance the person on the other end of the line would begin hurling obscenities at them as soon as they answered. When Berry opened her emails, she steeled herself for the barrage of hateful, frequently obscene messages that would flood her inbox. Generally, Berry felt with a justifiable pride that she was hard to scare. But as she admitted, I was scared here. I was absolutely scared here. I'm definitely scared of white supremacists and misogynists who want me dead. The emails gave her the chills. You're a brazen hypocrite who gets off on torturing children, much like your creepy Nazi Pope gets off on torturing puppies. As I said, weird. Moreover, you and anyone going along with your mass coerced medical experiment and the prolonged torture of children will face judgment when a fairly typical one dated October 28th, 2021. After a few more venomous paragraphs, the author signed off with a happy Halloween. It was, to say the least, creepy. But when Berry forwarded it to the sheriff's office, the sheriff determined that it didn't rise to the level of a specific criminal threat. On Facebook, one outraged anti-vaxxer waxed that, quote, "It is my religious freedom to not get vaccinated." And then, using most unreligious language, he waned, "Fuck every single one of you cunts." Hundreds of miles to the south, in California's sparsely populated Shasta County, Public Health Officer Karen Ramstrung, along with her supporters in county government, were facing a similar set of terrors. As COVID spread, and as local public health officials desperately tried to craft regulations to keep the populace safe, talk radio hosts would go on their shows and tell their audience of anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, anti-rhinos, Republicans in name only, and anti-Black Lives Matter, that it was time for blood to flow in the streets. Communists only recognize the limits of their power when their necks are stretched, opined one shock jock on the Reading-based KCNR 1460 AM radio station. A Facebook group called Open Shasta put up a posting about, quote, "taking out Dr. Ramstrom." A flood of other online threats soon followed. Anti-vaxxers picketed the public health officers. Fearing violence, the Reading Police Department ramped up patrols of Ramstrom's neighborhood. So intimidating were the threats that for a short time, Ramstrom even had a security team stationed around her house. She put up cameras around her home. After a slew of particularly horrifying threats, she had to give statements to investigators from the DA's office. When she looked to the county's elected officials for support, Ramstrom was rebuffed. Several hard-right members of the county board of supervisors pointedly refused to meet with her to show their support in light of the threats that she was facing. Instead, they urged their colleagues to go to bat against the county's and the state's public health responses, and to refuse to enforce the lockdown non-essential business closings, and masking mandates. When the more moderate members balked at this, the hard-right contingent, backed by local militia members, parents' rights advocates, and a bevy of fundamentalist churches, pushed a recall campaign against them, and in doing so, turned Shasta County into an epicenter for the burgeoning anti-vaccine and anti-masking movements building to a head across America. By 2022, most of the moderates have been driven out of county government. Ramstrom herself, after enduring months of protests against her, had been fired, as had many of the other top officials in public health and community services in the county. And the new hard-right majority on the Board of Supervisors, perhaps having realized the political potency of a heavily armed crowd, was pushing to make the rural locale a, quote, Second Amendment sanctuary county. And that's where I'm going to stop reading, because I do want to make time for questions, for comments, for conversation. I don't know exactly who's here because I haven't looked up the participants list, but I hope that friends, family, strangers, and anybody else in the audience, please feel free to ask questions. And thank you for attending today.
Thank you, Sasha. And I will give people time to get your questions into the Q&A tab in the bottom. We'll take those for a moment. I have a few of my own. There's really such a powerful intersection here between a kind of anti-science and this just blind faith and belief in rightness, in things that they must be right. There's some other work that's been done in alt-right communities and far-right communities about this real deep fundamentalism, right? That the kind of attention to the text doesn't go away, that people use Google to help them find the real truth that they so-called don't find in social and mainstream media. And one of the things that I think you do so beautifully in this book is you bring to bear what happens when that shared sense of truth, it is, I was going to say disintegrates, but it's really ripped to shreds. And you do that so well on the local level. How did it feel being a journalist from, national magazines in these communities at this time where people just, gave you these responses that had nothing to do with anything close to reporting truth, science? How did it feel for you being in there?
I find it fascinating and I found it disturbing. I mean, the breakdown of the idea of common truth is one of the most deadly, literally one of the most deadly phenomenon in modern times, not just in the United States, but all over the world. The rise of the internet and then the rise of social media, as you know, completely transformed the way that we get information. Now, newspapers in the old days, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they weren't perfect, but they did have gatekeepers. They had editors. They had fact checkers on a good day. They had some people who'd been professionally trained who had an idea of, how do I construct an accurate story? How do I get accurate sources? How do I verify the accuracy of those sources? Well, when you replace newspapers with the internet and especially with social media, into the vacuum, you get rumor. Because there is no fact checking on the internet. There is no verifiability. And these social media platforms very deliberately say, we are not media organizations. We're just platforms. What people put on those platforms is up to them. Well, if it so happens that people circulate absolute nonsense, whether it's the Pizzagate conspiracy in 2016, which said that Hillary Clinton and a whole bunch of leading Democrats were in charge of a pedophilia ring run out of a pizza parlor in DC, or whether it's anti-vaccination conspiracy theories that you're going to be microchipped if you get the vaccine, or that you're going to, become allergic to beef, which is something that Alex Jones said on his InfoWars. If you have just absolute nonsense that circulates as truth, and you have a social media mechanism that feeds that nonsense through an algorithm-based news distribution system that basically doesn't have any sense of right and wrong or fact and falsehood, all it does is it feeds you more of what you want to hear or more of what you want to see. If you have all of that, it's not surprising that when you go into a small community where there's, a paucity of competitive news sources, that you get rumor and you get an awful lot of people glomming onto conspiracies. How did it feel going into a place like Shasta County? I found it fascinating. And, a lot of the people I talked to were larger than life characters in every sense of the word. There was a barber I interviewed called Woody Clendenin. I didn't agree with anything he said pretty much, but he was a fascinating guy to talk to. And he was a character. He had this worldview that was, 180 degrees away from where my worldview was. But I kind of enjoyed going into his barber shop and talking to him and seeing all the, crazy signs he had on his wall and everything else. And I think, that goes to the heart of this. If you're a good journalist, you tell a story wherever that story takes you. And in this case, that story took me down a whole bunch of weird byroads and into a whole bunch of communities I was unfamiliar with. I loved reporting it. It just made me deeply sort of fearful of the, future of where this country is heading.
Well, and you give such humanity to the characters. I mean, I think that's something that's really, truly impressive about the reporting. And I'm not just saying this, to flatter you, Sasha. I mean, so I come from Appalachian, Kentucky, and in my lifetime, I've seen my own county go from so democratic that there was not even Republican primaries being held to a county that now voted in the last election 87% for Trump. My mother, a Democrat, held political elected office for 36 years. The last time, ran, the ratio of the vote was 75% to 25%. I mean, she just dominated the county. That's really hard. The Democrats sort of whisper when I go home, right? There's like we can't talk too loudly. So one of the things that I think is really neat about your book is, that's a story. It's easy for people to tell stories about conspiracy and the far right in those exotic places like Kentucky and Arkansas, and but this is Washington State and California State, both two very deeply blue states. They will definitely go blue in the federal elections, and to find these pockets of that, I think, brings also a kind of humanity to the question we're talking about. That this isn't people aren't immune here from falling into those deep conspiratorial thinking rabbit holes.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And when you're talking about Appalachia and how sort of it's zagged rightward in recent years, in a way that would have been an easier story to write because, you can find it all over the South especially, but you can also find it all over the Midwest. You can find these areas that over the last 10, 20 years have flipped absolutely in terms of their party political allegiances. And, you can make an argument whether or not the individuals in those counties have changed politically or whether it's the parties that have changed. It's probably a mixture of both. But the harder story, as you said, is what happens in communities where the broader state is liberal, but you have these conservative enclaves that feel utterly disempowered and utterly disenfranchised, and then they sort of feel very resentful. And that resentment gets channeled, and someone like Donald Trump is an absolute master at sort of finding ways in to harness that resentment and that anger and that fury. And that's where the story gets interesting, when you have sort of a national demagogic political moment, but then it percolates downwards and you have local copycat figures, whether it's the mayor of Sequim or whether it's some of these sort of street orators in Shasta County, who basically are mimicking the language and the rage of Donald Trump, but maybe migrating it a little bit to meet the needs of their particular county or their particular town. And that's a much more complicated story. And, when you look at, again, I'm trying to work out 6 weeks out from the election. I look at Donald Trump ranting and raving about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs, and I'm thinking to myself, how on earth can anybody vote for this man? How on earth can anybody in all good conscience and all seriousness look at this ranting and raving, madman, as far as I'm concerned? How can they vote for him? But I think if you understand that feeling of sort of local disempowerment, if you understand that feeling of disaffiliation and this feeling that the culture has left them behind, it doesn't make it more justifiable, but it makes it slightly more understandable.
So it's not just about human gullibility, as one of the audience members asks.
No, it's not just. I mean, there is a degree of gullibility. Certainly, when people are just clicking on any internet rumor that comes their way, and then that shapes how they vote and that shapes their understanding of the world, there is gullibility. You know, when you talk to people and unemployment is at 3.4 or 3.5%, which is what it was last year, and they tell you, well, it's the worst economy since the Great Depression, which an awful lot of people will tell you if you talk to them. That's gullibility. That means that they're getting a steady drip of misinformation, whether it's from Fox News or One News America or, you know, all of these different internet methods of getting ideas out there. But it is gullibility. But the more interesting question, I think, is not that people are gullible. That's a given. People have always been gullible. It's why is gullibility now sort of so fundamental to our politics? Why has the sort of language of expertise become so discredited? Why, you know, is a critical number of people not just willing to be gullible, but celebrating it? You know, celebrating every outlandish theory that Donald Trump comes up with on the campaign stump. And so, you know, they may in their heart of hearts know it's nonsense, but they like the fact that he's sticking his finger in the eye of the man. They like the fact that he's saying these crazy things, and it's just driving what the people they call the libtards, the liberals, it's driving the liberals mad. And they call it owning the libs. There's this whole language about sort of using inflammatory rhetoric, using outrageous behavior to own the libs. Well, you know, if that's where our politics has degenerated to, it's really, really bad, because it means people aren't making informed decisions. They're treating the whole thing as an entertainment spectacle.
That gives us a lot of hope for the next 6 weeks, and I'm going to come to that. But you know, one of the questions, and this is from Andrew Curry, asks this. And Andrew asks, you know, the obvious question is, what are the social and public dynamics of the county that this is Clallam County that pushes back against, as opposed to the county that doubles down? What makes the difference?
Well, this was a fascinating story to me, because Sequim isn't an inherently right-wing place. The Olympic Peninsula's sort of odd. It's got some very conservative enclaves, some very liberal enclaves. It's also got a lot of economic dislocation, because it used to be a timber center. And for various reasons in the 1990s on in, that economy bottomed out. So it's left with a hollowed out economy. And tourism has replaced some of that, and sort of boutique cafes and all the things of the service economy has replaced some of that. But there's also a lot of resentment and anger. So I think, you know, some of the rightward drift is explained by economic dislocation. But some of it in Sequim was explained by a sort of fit of absence of mind. It wasn't that the entire city had suddenly become right-wing and thus you had a QAnon supporting mayor end up in charge. It was that an awful lot of people just don't pay attention to local elections. They don't vote. The participation rate in local elections is dismal. It's about 20 to 25% nationally. Well, if people don't vote, it gives an organized minority, a conservative organized minority, a disproportionate amount of influence. And that's what happened in Sequim. But the thing was, there actually still were an awful lot of people who didn't buy into that theory, and they looked at what was happening, and it wasn't just liberals and it wasn't just Democrats. It was people across the spectrum, all the way through to moderate Republicans. They looked at this and they said, this is insanity. Nothing's getting done. You know, local government's supposed to fix potholes. Local government's supposed to be very pragmatic. And instead, you've got a mayor going on the radio and saying, hey, guys, pay attention to QAnon. And you got that same mayor going onto his Facebook and social media feeds and just repeating one QAnon conspiracy idea after another. And these critical number of residents said this can't stand. And they formed something called the Sequim Good Governance League. And the Sequim Good Governance League was basically set up to bring together a coalition of people who wanted to restore pragmatism and moderation and common sense to government. And they started fielding political candidates. And when you get to the second half of my book, because the book isn't all doom and gloom, if it was, none of you guys would buy it. You'd buy some, you know, escapist novel instead. But there actually is some hope here, because what the Sequim story shows is that if people start paying attention, and if critical numbers of people actually get involved, they can push back quite successfully. Because in Sequim anyway, it turned out that the Conservatives weren't the majority. Whatever they said about, you know, we represent the common people, turned out they didn't. They were just really, really loud. They were really good at blustering, and they were really good at bullying, and they sort of managed to fool the populace into thinking they represented a majority. Turns out when people get engaged, there are many more good people in a place like Sequim than QAnon supporters. And I think that's the sort of real eye-opener. And the second part of the book really, you know, again, at a very granular level, reports on how this was done.
Well, the timing of this, of course, coming 6 weeks before the U.S. presidential elections is an interesting time and a great platform for you to be able to share your insights. And I'm sure you get this question a lot. What lessons, this comes from John, I'm paraphrasing, what lessons do you think could be applied on the ground over the coming weeks to prevent Trump's reelection?
I know what should be done. People should be paying attention. People should be listening and thinking about the issues and not considering this an entertainment spectacle. And above all, people should realize it does make a difference, because there's an awful lot of opinion polling where a shockingly large number of people just say, doesn't make a difference. Doesn't matter to me who's president. Doesn't matter to me who controls the Senate. Doesn't even matter to me whether I live in a democracy or a dictatorship. There's been a survey, I think it's conducted by the University of Pennsylvania. I may have the institution wrong, but there's a survey on public attitudes that found a shockingly large number of young people said it makes absolutely no difference to live in a democracy or a dictatorship. Well, that's a recipe for catastrophe, because it clearly makes a difference. I know we have a short attention span these days, but you only need to think about what Donald Trump's presidency represented last time around, 2016 to 2020. The chaos that was unleashed, the cruelty that was unleashed, the sycophancy that was unleashed as you sort of replaced an administration with a regime. Well, if he gets into power again in 2024, I can guarantee it will be worse. He said it will be worse. He said he will prosecute his enemies. He said he will use the army to enforce law in big cities. He said he will deport millions and millions of people. And he said, well, I'll deport undocumented immigrants. But then he goes off on a tear about, you've got to get the Haitians out of Springfield, Ohio. Well, that's 20,000 legal immigrants. They've got status. They've got paperwork. So, when you look at what Trump's proposing, and when you look at the caliber of the people he's surrounding himself with, you got a pretty good indication of what would follow. Whether or not it would be a full-fledged dictatorship, I don't know. But it certainly wouldn't be a traditional version of liberal American democracy. So, this idea that it doesn't matter, yes, it matters very much. And I think over the next 6 weeks, anybody who cares, I don't really care whether people are left wing or right wing, but anyone who cares about the structures of government and the durability of democracy should be having that conversation with their friends, their colleagues, their relatives, etc. Because this does matter, and it matters profoundly.
That's a great call to action. I'm going to bring in a question from one of our visiting scholars at the center, Antonio Casilli. And I'm going to paraphrase. So Antonio pulls to sociologist Jen Schrade's work. Jen did her PhD at Berkeley. She's in her book, she's suggested that since the Trump era, the far right has become far more effective at organizing online. And she actually makes this argument that online organizing, the far right's just the right has been much more effective. Do you have thoughts on the organizing strategies of the right versus the left?
I think it depends where. Certainly the right has been extremely good at crafting a culture online of internet trolling. Now, to be fair, there are certainly people and certainly groups on the left that do their fair share of obnoxious trolling online, but disproportionately, the right has been sort of very, very good at creating an angry culture and spreading a sort of, massive amount of misinformation. And I think they've realized, in a way that maybe the left didn't realize, that the internet offers up opportunities to create movements of the disaffected. It sort of gives this sort of sense of a faux community. So all these sort of individuals who, if left to their own devices, might be quite isolated, suddenly are part of this bigger, grander movement, this nationalist movement, this racial movement, this, male supremacy movement, whatever it might be. And it creates a sort of very fast-moving entertainment kind of politics. Now, that said, on the ground, if you sort of factor out the internet, on the ground, I think progressives have been extremely good at organizing in the last few years, especially around abortion and reproductive rights access. So, this election may be the first election in several election cycles where Democrats actually have controlled the language to a fair degree, because certainly for much of the 21st century, even in elections Republicans didn't win, it was being fought on their linguistic terrain. But abortion actually offers the Democrats an opportunity to sort of blow that narrative up, because it offers an opportunity to say, you talk about freedom, but you're making women wait in parking lots until they're almost bleeding to death before they qualify for a life-saving abortion. How's that freedom? And you saw in the debate, Kamala Harris, went on the offensive again and again and again on precisely that issue. So I think there is more good grassroots organizing going on now among progressives, but I think they're playing catch up. And there certainly was this decade-long period where at the local level, Democrats were absent. They just didn't have a ground game for local government control. They didn't have a ground game for the election of judges at a local level. They didn't have a ground game for state legislatures, which is why so many state legislators flipped and became Republican in the last 10 to 15 years. Well, you need that. You don't just need the presidency. You need every level of the political process in order to craft a coherent movement capable of getting things done. And, again, I think the Democrats have learned that lesson, but they're playing catch up at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know this is on a lot of people's mind on this call. We have Nigel Farage's party in Parliament now. And Olivia Fletcher asks, to what extent do you think these factors are at play in the US, are unique to the US? And to what extent are similar factors influencing our politics in the UK and or Europe?
No, it's a great question. And I don't think there are certain things unique to America, not least the fact that America is the most heavily armed civilian population on earth. So there are 800 million weapons in private hands globally. 400 million of those weapons are in the US. This is a spectacularly heavily armed country. And there's been this increasing willingness amongst militias, amongst street fighting groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and so on, to brandish those weapons in public, and in some instances to use those weapons or to threaten to use them. That is distinct, and that's unique to sort of America's relationship to the Second Amendment and to guns. But the rest of it, I think your questioner is right. When you look at Nigel Farage's rise, it's not that dissimilar to Trump's rise, except for the fact that thankfully Farage is not in power and has never been in power. He's a backbench MP. But if you look at the rise of the AfD in Germany, or you look at the rise of some of the other far-right parties, whether it's Meloni in Italy or whether it's Marine Le Pen coming within a hair's breadth of political power in France, there are some pretty right-wing populist forces that have been unleashed. And again, some of that's to do with the internet, some of that's to do with technological changes that make people feel that they're not keeping up with the culture, that they feel disempowered and feel unsecure. Part of it is to do with immigration and, working out ways to absorb immigration without producing a right-wing populist backlash. And working out ways to talk about immigration without producing a right-wing populist backlash. So I don't think this is a unique issue to America, but as you all know, what happens in America, because America has such a vast global footprint, the rest of the world feels it immediately. So if Nigel Farage, God forbid, sort of, became a cabinet secretary, it would be a horrible thing, but it wouldn't impact the rest of the world immediately in the way that if Donald Trump becomes president, or if Stephen Miller becomes, attorney general or whatever it is, that will instantly impact the rest of the world.
Well, and the money that is spent in the US presidential campaigns dwarfs any election in the world. So it creates a experimental playground for where new tools and tricks can be rolled out. So it is another way of the leadership of the United States and kind of the political toolkit becomes part and parcel around the world of this. There's a question from Christine Adams about the role of bots and farms and spreading disinformation. And I want to take this question. So there's this bizarre abuse, and people, we've tracked people, particularly women in public settings, are subject to this just really vile and often amplified hatred targeted towards them. What role do you think some optimistic attempts to tamp that down can play? Or do you have any optimism at all of things like the Online Safety Act in the UK or other attempts to hold platforms to account for the spreading of mis and dis and malinformation?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and in a way, you're probably far more qualified to answer it than I am. But a couple of thoughts. Yes, this technology is hard to control because it's transnational. It ignores national boundaries. I mean, China is quite good at sort of clamping down on internet freedom, but most countries that don't have the sort of totalitarian bent of China have a sort of live and let live approach to the internet. And, on balance, I'd say a live and let live approach is better than, a draconian political clampdown. But I do think you can hold at least platform owners to account if they set up systems that are designed to spread disinformation and designed to accelerate political violence. And certainly X in recent years has replatformed some extremely violent characters and has given a sort of high priority to an extremely violent messaging. And I do think that you can create legislation that says, you know what, you are going to be held to account. There are going to be certain standards. And you could use the libel laws, and you can use a whole bunch of different laws to make it more difficult for platforms to spread disinformation. But I don't think it's easy, because I do think the internet is this sort of free-form, amorphous thing that changes shape. It changes shape so quickly, and one platform can be replaced by another so quickly. And you saw it with the rise of Telegram and all these encrypted messaging systems. It's very, very difficult to contain. So I think a sort of better answer, rather than sort of looking for lots and lots of laws to clamp down on the internet, a better answer is to educate people. We make students learn to read and write and learn basic math and basic history and basic civics when we're in school because it's a social good. Well, we should teach people in schools media literacy and media hygiene. We should teach people how to distinguish between a website that's spouting nonsense and a website using credible sources. Well, we don't do that at the moment. Some countries are starting to pass legislation to make media literacy part of the core requirements, but most countries haven't gone down that road yet, and we should. And I think that would be a far more effective way of reining in the sort of bots and all these other things that we're talking about.
I'm going to throw out one final question and wrap some comments around it, but I want to give you also the charge to think about your message of hope for this audience, leaving us on a high. So an anonymous attendee reminds us that what could work is revision of Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act that, for those on the call who don't know, give freedom from liability for social media platforms for content that people post. So it doesn't hold them to account for the amplification of mis and disinformation. But Terry McAllister asks, you make clear that there's such genuine anger from the economically left behind communities who willingly channel their frustration through Trump and Farage and others. But surely liberal democratic politicians and mainstream media have failed to meet the needs of these disaffected people. How could they have done that, and how should they do this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an interesting one, because if you actually look at the Democrats' economic policy in America, by most rational measures, if you're struggling economically, you'd be better off with a Democratic platform that, for example, expands access to affordable healthcare, that expands child tax credits, that expands paid parental leave and sick leave. There are several sort of very obvious ways in that the Democrats should be able to reshape a message to appeal to people who are feeling left behind economically. The problem is that you have very conservative messaging that has been very effective in recent years at saying, yes, you're suffering economically, and there are a few people who are responsible. One is these other groups, whether it's immigrants coming in or asylum seekers or, black people taking white jobs or whatever nonsense is spouted. But there is certainly this messaging that the others are taking what's rightfully yours. But then the second message is, and the liberals are elites. They're all Ivy League school educated, know-it-all experts, and they're pushing all these measures that at the end of the day are just going to cost you more in taxes, not going to really help you. Well, that messaging becomes particularly effective if you've degraded government to the point that people look at government and they say, all right, you're right, government doesn't work. There was a very conservative sort of think tank leader called Grover Norquist, who is famous for saying that he wanted to shrink government to the extent that you could strangle it in the bathtub. Well, that's been the Republican project since Reagan. If you shrink government services and you have more homeless people, you have more people who struggle to access drug treatment or mental health services, well, then, of course, civic society looks like it's failing and the government looks like it can't do anything. And of course, people are then going to be suspicious when liberals turn around and say, well, you know what, let's have a bit of faith in government, let's spend a bit more, because people are going to say, tried that, did it, didn't work, we spend the money, and all that happened was our taxes went up, we didn't see an improvement in our quality of life. So the bigger challenge here is, how do you restore faith in government? How do you restore faith in the decency of government institutions to help people? And you can do it. I mean, the New Deal did it very effectively. Roosevelt fundamentally reimagined the relationship between government and the population. It can be done. It just takes a lot of work. Paradoxically, Biden, who is sort of ending his presidency as a very unpopular president, Biden actually reimagined government in probably the most profound way since Franklin Roosevelt. And he managed to get legislation passed that has had a huge impact on the way the economy functions and has had a huge tangible impact on the tax structure, on the access to healthcare for people, and on a whole bunch of other issues. So Biden did a lot of these things. He just failed to message it effectively, and the messaging got lost.
I think that's a great answer. In 20 or 30 seconds, fast forward to early November. What do we look forward to?
Oh my gosh, can you see my blood pressure going up with that question? I mean, my hope is that common sense prevails and that decency prevails. Because I don't even think it's a left-wing, right-wing thing at this point. I mean, obviously there are left-wing, right-wing debates to be had, but the very idea that, somebody with Trump's extraordinary resume of criminality and amorality could come near political power again is horrifying. So, I hope what we have to look forward to is that over the next 6 weeks, that becomes clearer. And it becomes clearer that this really is a choice between constitutional government and, some American version of autocracy, and that it really is a choice between, common decency and courtesy and, the worst impulses of the internet troll, of the bully, of the intimidator. I don't know how that's going to play out. I really don't, but I sincerely hope that the better angels win on this one.
And chaos doesn't come calling.
Yes, and that my book becomes completely irrelevant, but not before you've all bought it and read it.
Sasha, I don't think the lessons in here are going to be, I think the lessons in here are going to be relevant for a long time. Thank you, Sasha, so much. This was really fascinating. The team are going to now in the webinar chat, they're going to put the link for ordering your book from the UK. So you can go ahead and order that book from Hachette and from Amazon.com immediately. I want to thank everybody on the call for attending. The questions were great. It's really great to have you here tonight to think, and today to think through these issues with us. Here at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, we would very much appreciate if you could just complete a short feedback questionnaire that will be sent to you via Eventbrite. And please stay in touch for details of future seminars, events. All of our updates can be found on the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy website, and that's mctd.ac.uk. And wherever you are in the UK or sunny Southern California, anywhere in between or beyond, thank you for joining us today. And again, thanks to Sasha for this really great piece of work. Thank you.
It's a joy. Thank you.
Thank you.